Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts.
Hey everybody, we're now accepting applications for our Network Catalyst Accelerator program. Founders in our program have gone on to raise money from Lux, Spark, A16Z, Slow, First Round, SUSE, Homebrew, Mavron, Obvious, NFX, Signalfire, and many more. Learn more and apply at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with two very special guests, Meera Clark of Obvious Ventures and Annie Kadavy of Redpoint. Annie, Meera, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much.
So the origin of this podcast is Meera, you wrote this blog post called Religious Realignment a couple months ago, and kind of wanted to get into it. Why don't you talk about what you were trying to do with that piece, what inspired you to write it, and what you hope people took from it?
So I think kind of to set the stage here, at a high level, there were two structural factors that really stood out to me, and I think a third that is becoming more and more clear as we make our way through 2020. One was this ongoing loneliness epidemic that, we all continue to reference, but that at the same time kind of continues to get worse. I think that, as we all know, 79% of people today report being frequently stressed, and nearly half of Americans report frequently feeling alone. And so really thinking about why this is the case, what structural support systems have existed in the past that have that are maybe not providing the same levels of support today. I think on the flip side, a trend I kind of continue to notice in my own life was this, very gradual retreat of religion in the lives of so many of the people that I know and love and interact with on a daily basis. I think kind of the stats support it as it relates to kind of the numbers of individuals identifying with no religion kind of doubling over the past several years, and this trend continuing to increase, particularly in the past 5 years. And so kind of taking a step back, I sought to understand kind of what have we lost with this decline in religion, and then kind of how can we look to mitigate these factors moving forward. I think what's interesting in today's environment is kind of as we all face COVID-19 and what that means in our daily lives, we are seeing individuals increasingly turning towards different spiritual practices, ranging from, mindfulness to meaning to more community-oriented practices. And so as part of my piece, I look to distill down the realms of religion to kind of three primary spheres and identify different buckets within those spheres. I kind of thought of them as me, what goes on within my own mind, within my own experience, extending on from me, looking at my community, kind of what goes on within my community, anything from kind of community to ritual or inspirational engagement. And then from there, I expanded into the world beyond, looking more at charity and morality as influential factors. So that is very, a high level nuts and bolts of the piece, but I'm, excited to discuss more about it and bring in Annie's perspectives as well.
Totally. And you have a pie chart here where you sort of mapped out this unbundling of religion. You have community, inspirational engagement, ritual, morality, charity, mindfulness, and meaning. And then, lots of startups in those various spaces. What was that process of making the map like, or how did you sort of unbundle it to different spaces, or were there, things not to include? How did you sort of make sense of it in that way?
I think as with so many of us, I, look to take a lot of inspiration from the people around me, and particularly taking into account diverse perspectives around me. I grew up in a household with a Hindu mother and a Catholic father. And the practices across those two religions, on the surface look incredibly different. But then as you dig deeper, kind of share many similarities. And so I kind of began to have conversations with individuals across religions to understand what those overarching themes that did begin to emerge across groups, and then look to kind of categorize them into these categories like meaning or inspirational engagement from there. I think this was a piece that was really looking to incorporate, both ancient perspectives and new and emerging points of view. So really look to bring, different generations together as contributors, different religious affiliations together as contributors to kind of provide at least a framework for others to leverage as kind of society as a whole continues to build upon this conversation.
Totally. I want to go one by one through every category, but first, Annie, I'm curious for you, what's coming to mind as we're talking here? You've been investing for a long time. How have you approached some of these topics, or what's most interesting about this for you?
Sure. Meera and I caught up, earlier this year, and we were both so excited about religion and the future of religion and what does that mean for consumer products and how people are going to behave. And then she wrote this great blog post, which I'm excited to spend more time on. I think about consumer investing from a first principles, and there are a couple of ways to do that. One is, where do dollars flow? Where do people invest their money? And we can talk in a second about where people invest their time. Religion is obviously a big recipient of both. I was just looking it up, and people in the U.S. Donate roughly $50 billion a year to churches. And on average, that is people who are giving somewhere between 10 and 20% of their income, which is far more than any other kind of non-base spending category. Your home and food. So if you just start right there and you say, there's an opportunity to invest in consumer products where dollars already exist, as opposed to creating or forcing a group of people to invest dollars in something that's net new, you got to believe that people are willing to spend for a form of religion. The next question might be, well, what is it that they're actually paying for? And, to use Meera's framework here of, is this because they're giving for a charitable or moral feeling that they want to have, or a belief that they think they should or ought to, and they're choosing their religious association as the way to do so? Is it something where they are in a way paying for a community, or is it a way that they are in some way paying for an identity? I'm not sure I know the answer, but I think it's an interesting set of things to explore.
Yeah. And before getting into the individual categories, just to help better ground the conversation, I'm curious, Annie, where in consumer over the last 6 months or year, or maybe even just now, are you most excited about, or have done deep dives in, or have sort of, you want to see more entrepreneurs, more pitches, innovating on, or more pitches? Like, where within consumer, separate from religion, are you most excited about right now?
Well, as we all do this podcast sheltered from our respective homes, I think that 2020 is going to be a very interesting year for consumer products and services. This, forcing people to be in their homes, more remote, is, one of the world's most interesting global consumer experiments. And obviously, it's not for a reason that any of us are happy for or would ever choose, but the implications still are going to be real regardless of the reason for it. So I'm interested in how people spend their time, especially in an increasingly connected global environment. People have choice of where to spend their time. What used to take a lot of time to do, let's just think of the errands a family might run over the course of a week, everything from feeding their children to cleaning their home to transporting themselves and their families to and from school or work. Those things are actually all getting easier. They are all getting less frictionful. You have more and more of the population who can work either part-time or now, as we are witnessing, full-time remote. And what that does is it gives you extra time. On a personal level, I've been feeling like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden I have an extra 60 to 90 minutes a day that I was spending commuting. What do I do with that? Which is a luxurious problem to have, but also something that I think a lot of other folks are navigating too. So I think that there will be an opportunity for companies to build on that.
Let's get into some of the categories. So let's do community first. Meera, you put a bunch of different types of companies here, everything from Bumble to Summit Series to CrossFit to AARP. How did to Strava? How did you sort of think about this category, and where's most exciting for you now?
Yeah, so I think kind of at the time when I was thinking about community as a category, leveraging Annie's points, it came down to kind of two primary goals. One was this sense of identity. What community do I identify with? And two, how do I drive connections with other individuals and with groups as a whole? I think, in today's environment where we are, restricted to our own homes, but seeking connection outside of the home, particularly given kind of the importance on these connections from a mental health perspective, I think we're seeing kind of people hunger for community perhaps even more than ever before. I think as it relates to community, as I thought about which categories were most attractive, here I chose to include kind of both legacy providers like a YMCA to, the newest, buzziest venture-backed startups, to highlight the fact that across any of these categories or really any consumer categories, many of the best companies, can be venture funded, but all of the best companies certainly do not need to be. And so as I thought about community, I thought about kind of where one could build enduring brands. And to me, those enduring brands are the ones that will drive kind of the stickiest levels of engagement and those that will drive kind of the most tangible benefits for their users, whether those benefits are kind of a sense of belonging and decreased social stress, or kind of highly valuable professional connections that might drive someone's, career trajectory forward. And so highlighting, again, the breadth of how we spend our lives on a day-to-day, kind of picking buckets where, sure, in the morning before work, you might be attending a SoulCycle class, which represents a community that you very closely align with, where after work, you might be swinging by the assembly to do, XYZ art class or XYZ guided meditation that, again, brings you closer to those that you align with, that you learn with, that you learn from, and that you want to identify with. And so really taking more of a holistic perspective to what community might mean. I think what the interesting shift we're seeing in community, and one of the big questions that I'm hearing today from founders and investors alike, is what formats can community take, and what formats will the most successful communities take, whether that is digital or in real life. I think there are certainly elements of human connection that are lost via a format like Zoom, anything from eye contact to the pheromones that someone might be secreting. But as we think about scale and the ability to build kind of individual close-knit neighborhoods under a very large branded umbrella, I think we are seeing the increasing value of many of these digital platforms to rapidly scale and provide access to these connections to as many users as possible across the country, if not the world.
Yeah. Annie, in a pre-COVID world, I'm curious how you were evaluating sort of community businesses like The Wing or sort of like Soho House for X. I don't know, there's sort of, this sort of resurgence of IRL communities that are trying to be venture backed. And my sort of question is, I have no doubt that they serve purpose and can be very, meaningful businesses. But the question was, are they venture scale? Like, are they, really technology businesses? Are they sort of, do you get the community to leverage that to get data for something else? This is my question with the grant always, trying to build a community to have meaningful conversations. And is that sort of a wedge to get this database of wisdom, or is that the business, is the community the business itself? How do you think about this?
I think I agree with what you're saying. So how I think about these new communities that have a brick and mortar component to them is, to what extent is the community tied linearly to the brick and mortar component? And so what you'd want to see, and you could look at this for a community business, you could look at it for a healthcare business, you could look at it for a retail business. What you want to see is that the revenue, and more importantly, the margin of the business, can expand exponentially, while the brick and mortar component of the business is expanding only linearly or sublinearly.
Yeah, I like that. I like that framing. And so, is there anything, whether in health or otherwise, in that vein that you've seen that is interesting?
Yeah, totally. I think we've seen a lot of things, and historically, I have not invested in any brick and mortar businesses for the same concern I think that has been, for whatever reason, believed in Silicon Valley for many years, is that real estate businesses don't scale. I think that we could probably save ourselves the time to not go down to the WeWork spiral in this case. But, even though WeWork has certainly struggled, it does prove that a business with a real estate component at its core can be a very, very large business. So, One of my most recent investments actually was the first company I've invested in that has a brick and mortar component. It's a business called Tend. It's a dental business based in Manhattan. And it's a full kind of set of services and products, both in real time, right? You could imagine getting your teeth cleaned or getting a cavity filled, but then you could also imagine how that might extend to broader oral health or products.
Totally. How have you thought about mental health, Annie? Have there ever been any mental health startups that you got close to funding? Or how do you view the category?
Yeah, I would love to see more companies built in the mental health category. I think it's something that people need. I think it's something that people crave. I think it's something that the healthcare system as it currently stands is not particularly well formed to serve. Per our earlier conversation, many of the mental health startups, at least that I've seen in the last, let's say, 12 to 18 months, have been brick and mortar at their core. Those are they're harder to grow. Their growth rates are going to be capped because they're capped by geographic locations. Doesn't make them bad businesses, but it just changes the growth profile that they have. There have been other companies that have started that have been purely digital, right? Some of them have been text-based, others have been video-based. So a company like Lyra or Talkspace. I think those are very interesting approaches to it, but it doesn't really solve the underlying problem, which is that of insurance. Mental health is reimbursed at a lower rate than almost any other practice because, at least my understanding is that it's quite difficult to have a high level of certainty on both outcome and the quality of the provider. And so until that changes or is solved, I think that the number of products that are offered to people need to manage their cost structure in a different way. And so something like Talkspace, I think, is a really interesting example because, I'm not an investor of the company, but I would suspect just based on the type of platform that the cost to serve an individual person is going to be much lower than an in-person, face-to-face therapy session would be. And I think that's actually probably the most compelling way to open up the market.
Yeah. Sarah Talbot came on this podcast and we talked about sort of she's really excited about social again. And sort of the she invested in a company that is like unbundling YouTube, I think one specific vertical, and also, Discord is sort of, a vertical network that's, for gaming. Is there something in social that you're excited about, or how do you sort of think about that?
I'm also very excited about social. We should be having a new social platform or multiple new social platforms right now. If you just look at it from kind of a generational evolution, it's time. We last year did a deep dive and looked at probably 60 social companies. There were a few areas that came from that we thought were most interesting, specifically around vertical networks. From a anthropological perspective, if you think about who are the consumers that are most likely to be using social media or adopting a new platform or service, they're people who are in, high school to college age mostly. Those folks not only grew up digitally native, they grew up social media native, which is a really important distinction. And so they, unlike someone like me, for example, that grew up and discovered Facebook later on, it was an opening up of the network I could have. And that was my choice to go broader. This generation was born into all of their things were already everywhere, and in some sense they're reacting to that, I think, and pulling back in, looking for something that's higher trust, higher control, higher autonomy. And so we've been looking at a lot of kind of vertical social networks in those spaces. I think the second example I might give, and then I'll tie it back to Meera's point earlier, is in business-oriented social networks. So we recently invested in a company called Bravado, similar to the idea of unbundling YouTube on a social, with a bunch of vertical social networks. I think you could believe that you could unbundle LinkedIn into a lot of vertical kind of business-oriented social networks is what I might call them. Bravado is that for sales professionals. And then tying it back, I think, the point that Meera makes so clearly in her post is about the value of community. And really that's what all of these networks are providing for people. And I think that in an increasingly distributed world, an increasingly digital world, this is what people are seeking.
more on the LinkedIn front, like after sales, what are other categories that you think are ripe, whether it's either horizontal categories like sales or sort of different, like things like, oil and gas, like rig up?
Yeah. Rig up I find to be a totally fascinating business. I just had an opportunity to speak with someone who had worked there. And what I learned, these are labor marketplaces, right? We've seen a lot of different verticalized labor marketplaces. Most of them are quite difficult businesses because effectively your LTV of a customer is low, meaning that the wage of that person is relatively low. In rig up, the wages of those people are very high. And that was something that I had not appreciated from looking at that business from afar. But that gives you basically the margin to grow a very big business, even if you're doing a single placement, certainly if you're doing multiple placements per person. So to answer your question, yes, the unbundling of LinkedIn, you could look at it by labor market verticals. And we've done some of that. There are, a lot happening in healthcare right now specifically. You can also look at it by job description or by job function, which is how we landed in Bravado. I could pontificate for a long time about why I think sales is the most interesting vertical that this could apply to. Maybe that's time for another podcast.
What's like the 15-second version, or what's the shortest version?
Okay. The quick version is that sales is the revenue generator of any company. Why that's important is that companies are willing to pay for tools and services that make them more efficient because it flows directly to their bottom line. That's number one. Number two is that if you play a game, which I played with Sahil, the CEO of Bravado, where if I were to send you, Erik, 10 different sales professionals' LinkedIn websites and ask you which one of these is the best seller, I would almost guarantee you that you're not going to be able to tell me because that information doesn't exist anywhere. The value that a salesperson has, if we think about, let's talk about like a software salesperson to start, though this would be extensible to other types of sales, is the relationships they have, the customers that they've sold, and the knowledge they have of the product or products that they've sold. That doesn't exist on LinkedIn today. It needs to exist in one place, and it's actually the true currency that these folks use when they're selling either inside their companies or cross companies. To take it one step further, I believe that in the future, sales teams will largely be decoupled from the companies that they work for today, where an individual seller instead will be, think of them more as their own company, and they're going to sell a portfolio of products that are similar on behalf of a portfolio of companies to an end customer. And if you believe that that's the future of what sales looks like, then you need a network that is sales rep specific as opposed to company centric.
Do you see similar opportunities to showcase? Like, I probably couldn't tell on LinkedIn who are the best recruiters or who are the best customer success people or who are the best. Like, are there other sort of job functions that you think are, oh yeah, this would make a ton of sense for that too?
There's got to be. I honestly don't have a great answer for you right now. The reason I like sales is because it's a revenue generating role. And so that would probably be my first filter in thinking about where else there would be opportunities here. Cool.
Meera, I'm curious, where are you most excited about in terms of companies that are trying to either bring community or solve loneliness? As we can tell from this podcast, there are multiple different approaches, from sort of a direct mental health approach to IRL communities to online communities to social networks to various other different types of wedges. Where are you most interested?
I think as we think about which businesses have the highest likelihood of success with respect to venture backing, I think going back to the broader space within mental health, that to us remains a really attractive category. Mental health is a category, $200 billion market, traditionally highly fragmented across practitioners, very challenging for individuals in need to find a clinician, very challenging to go through the insurance reimbursement process. And so I think that there is a lot of room for improvement on both the access and transparency sides of things. We are investors in one company in the space called Octave. It's a modern mental health clinic founded by the ex-chief strategy officer of One Medical. And what Octave is doing is bringing a modernized pairing approach to the patient and practitioner relationship. And then, ensuring that patients are receiving the kind of care that they expect. If that's a Gen Z a biracial female Gen Z patient, there's a higher likelihood that her clinician will look like her. And so I think that there are many areas across the mental health spectrum that have room for improvement. What I think is attractive about this category is the increasing interest from a lot of payers, both kind of benefits managers and more traditional insurance payers, to provide these services. I think that, we're continuing to see data come to light highlighting the importance of, one's behavioral health on their performance in the workplace, their general sense of well-being. And so I think that's an area that we like. I think that, as we think about the areas that will be most resilient, in the event of a downturn, it's areas that are perhaps not as dependent on consumer cash pay to keep the lights on. And so I think that's one area that we believe is ripe for disruption and presents a lot of opportunities for rapid scale for the right players.
Yeah, it's interesting. Going back to our social thing, I think today there's not, imagine if chat roulette had come out today. I feel like there's an opportunity.
I've talked about this with many friends. It would be crushing it in this environment.
Yeah. There's just an opportunity for something fun to come out that sort of just grabs everyone's attention.
Yeah, I think what's interesting on the chat roulette perspective, just to digress a bit, is the fact that with a platform like chat roulette, individuals are meeting people that they, are outside of their natural networks. I think as we look at behavior across Gen Z, which to Annie's point is perhaps the highest likely, the demographic with the highest likelihood of adopting a new social network, they are very open to becoming best friends with individuals that they've never met before in real life. I think there's a double-digit percentage of them that identify a best friend, in fact, that they've never met in person. And so I think, hopefully something with slightly greater safety precautions than a chat roulette, but something like that, I think, would be very interesting to experiment with in the near term.
I think Zoom bombing has become a thing.
Oh, yeah. I've gotten Zoom bombed.
Have you?
Yes. We hosted a freestyle rap session last night on Zoom. I did start up those chat roulette for rap battles in 2012. We brought it back over Zoom. We tweet out the public Zoom link, and not the most savory characters come into it, but that's okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, well, on the mental health thing for a sec, yeah, because there's a couple ways to handle loneliness. One is sort of everybody gets a therapist or coach or some version of that. Others is new ways of finding friendships or relationships. On the mental health front, I'm curious if you guys think there's an opportunity to sort of create a marketplace of listeners or sort of non-trained, not therapists, because they wouldn't be therapists, but so can that function be sort of unbundled in a way? Andy, you've done marketplaces forever. Have you looked at that? I mean, I'm sure there's 7 cups of tea. Is something like that interesting? Because not everyone can afford $150 an hour or needs that training. What do you think?
My favorite thing about marketplaces is that they democratize access for both sides, both for the people that are seeking the service and those that are seeking to provide the service. So with that as a backdrop, I would say there's no reason why there couldn't be a marketplace for, let's say, I think of it as citizen scientist mental health professionals to help one another. I think the challenge there would be trust. That's usually the challenge in building a marketplace, candidly, though. So no, I've not seen anyone who has built that. I'd be very curious to learn more about it.
I think within that space, we are, seeing slightly more in the very early stages, companies like TopNut focusing specifically on women, or NeedHop taking a broader population, thinking about marketplaces for effectively coaches and empowering individuals to serve as coaches for one another. Hopefully these platforms look slightly more updated than a Craigslist, but at the end of the day, it is very similar to Craigslist, but kind of transitioning from products to services, with that service being coaching. So definitely, I think something that would be interesting to monitor over the next few years.
Yeah. And then what about dating itself? Have you seen anything interesting dating in the last year, or could you imagine yourself making a startup investment in that space over the next couple of years, or does Tinder/Match really just have it on lockdown?
I'm happy to go. I think, we will definitely see more in dating over the next few years or even quarters. I think many of these the existing dating apps are pivoting to ensure that, their FaceTime capabilities or whatever are up and running. At the same time, I think there have been a number of new entrants into this space that are focused on IRL connections. I think going back to Annie's point that looking at someone's LinkedIn or looking at someone's dating profile doesn't necessarily tell the whole story, that are looking to do a better job of kind of uncovering who this person is at their core, and leveraging those traits to match compatibility. I think, as we think about, serving people's full sets of needs versus simply kind of matching Instagram profiles to one another, it'll be an interesting trend to watch. Annie, would love to hear your take, though. I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, no, I think, going back to Meera's blog post, in the community piece of the pie, you have Bumble and I'd put other dating apps in there. Dating apps are forms of social networks, in my opinion. And they also, just like any other social network, if you think about Facebook as the broad social network for quote unquote everybody, recognizing, of course, it's not that. What has then come, of course, are these verticalized social networks for people that are more like-minded, or they feel more similar, or they feel more comfortable speaking with just a smaller selection of folks. I think in dating, you see the exact same thing. It's another maturing market. You start as a kind of broad platform, and now each of these different dating apps, the brands stand for a different type of community or a different set of values. Sometimes those are productized into, who has control over who says yes to what, or if you can offer digital goods to one another, or, what your age or what your sexual orientation might be. Those are just examples of filters that you can put onto a social network. And if you believe that most people are searching for somebody who is like-minded in some sense, I think we'll continue to see those. I would not be opposed to making an investment in a dating company. I think the question would be, again, in a maturing market where there are a lot of other opportunities for people to, find new people to date. The question would be how, is there a big enough opportunity for someone to carve out a new one?
Yeah. I think one other area just to dive into really quickly within the dating space is simply looking at the market itself. If you look at millennials kind of 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 20% of millennials were single. Today, over 40% of millennials are single, kind of as they are, all sheltered in place in their homes, either with their parents or alone. I think that kind of that desire to connect with a life partner is likely to increase. And so as we simply think about kind of demand from the market, I think it's certainly something that we're likely to see kind of continue to grow over time.
I want to transition to inspirational engagement a little bit. A couple ways I look at it. There's sort of this like Calm, for X, Calm did it for meditation. There's a whole bunch of content meditation. There's obviously like a bunch of stuff related to like sexuality and relationships. With sort of a like Calm sort of like product, and then also like just business or other learning. But yeah, that sort of audio engagement, and then there are things like Masterclass or OutSchool or other sort of continuous learning. This is somewhat different. But Annie, you invested in Guild. Meera, what is exciting to you? Exciting to you there?
I guess as I think about inspirational engagement, I think what all of these platforms have in common is that they are leveraging stories to drive home lessons and frequently to highlight kind of first principles of specific areas. Historically within the church, we certainly saw this with sermons on Sundays. And I think that many view these as kind of grounding forces or sources of truth of how they should act in both their personal and professional lives. I think in the absence of kind of those guide rails in place, many do feel increasingly lost and are looking for kind of different leaders within the different areas of their lives. So I think that, what is important about the names listed is that they highlight a wide breadth, both in terms of kind of the demographics, psychographics that they target, as well as kind of the areas that they're focusing on, anything from core kind of professional leadership development to how to be a new mom to how to understand the best way to care for aging parents. And so I think kind of providing, going back to the coaching dynamic, some element of coaching from afar, as well as kind of a line of sight to a better future is what many of these have in common and what I think excites many people about the space.
Annie, how about you?
So one area of inspirational engagement that is closely aligned, I think, with religion that Meera and I have actually talked about a bit in the past is astrology. I think astrology is a bit of both of those things. In some ways, it is a religion in the sense that it is a guiding voice. It is something that brings people together. It is something that can instill values. It's something that informs how people make their decisions. It can be a community in a very real way. At the same time, it also, like religion, is inspirational many times, right? The horoscope column in the paper that used to come to my house every weekend was something I used to read as a kid because I found it so fascinating to see, oh my gosh, I'm a Virgo. What's happening to me in the month of February? And I think that is a very fundamental human curiosity, and whether astrology is what people turn to, or another form of religion, or another form of guidance, I think that there's a lot to be seen there.
Totally. Andy, one space you've invested quite a bit in is fitness. You did Tonal and you did ClassPass. How do you sort of seen the fitness landscape? You've done well in it, but it's a space that people have had VCs have had a hard time with.
Yeah. I could, give you the list of companies I didn't invest in that I wish I did. As I'm talking to you right now, right behind me literally is my Peloton that I had kind of, forgotten about. It was a piece of furniture and now is my new best friend in this recent shelter in place. So, how do I think about fitness? I think building a really large company in the fitness category is hard. And the reasons that it is hard are the same reasons that going to build an exercise routine or exercise every day is hard. It's something that people are generally more aspirational about than they are truly able and willing to build a routine out of. And that routine is tied to recurring payments. So we've seen a lot of digital only or digital first platforms that are sometimes they're marketplaces connecting individual people with individual instructors or small classes. Sometimes they're connecting with personal trainers or people who can help them build kind of a personalized workout plan, or maybe moving into something more holistic that might include food and general wellness. I think those businesses have a challenging CAC problem while they're growing. Partly is a commentary on all consumer businesses right now, where you have a really finite set of channels to go and pay for new people. And so your average CACs are much higher than they have been in years previously. And also because in this case, it's actually a very hard psychographic to filter for. It's not like you're just looking for men ages 25 to 27 who live in X, Y, or Z city. The mindset of a person that's looking for this kind of solution is a bit harder to find. And therefore that translates to a higher CAC.
Would that be your same analysis of, I guess, wellness more broadly, or are there subspaces within wellness or types of things that you're particularly interested in?
So I think about wellness increasingly as I think about it on a spectrum of wellness to healthcare and think everything in between. This is more commentary, I guess, on the healthcare system, right? As you have more self-insured employers, you have higher deductible plans, and you have a group of millennials that are coming into the healthcare system for the first time and running into the shitstorm that our health system is. There is a reaction and a desire to take control over one's healthcare that I don't think has existed in the same way before. Those companies that are building in the space are on a range from a true healthcare company, which I would define as a place that you go for a product or service, and it is both informed where you go and then paid for with insurance. And then there are those things that are paid for out of pocket purely at the discretion of the individual. That now is, it's a range of things. So, I'll take an example of a company like Parsley Health. I'm not an investor in Parsley. I find it a very interesting business, though, because it is in one part a medical system, but in one part is really a wellness play. Going back to our earlier conversation about brick and mortar businesses as venture bets, again, I think there's reason to believe a company like that could scale their revenue and margin disproportionately to their physical footprint, given the categories that they can play in across healthcare and out-of-pocket pay wellness.
Totally. I want to transition one of the other segments you have here, Meera, charity. Is there going to be a venture backed company, venture scale company that enables people to give more charitably. We've seen, lots of sort of AngelList for donations, or lots of those different types of companies. Will any of them work, or where are you excited to hear from a venture perspective?
I think jury's still out, which is not a great answer to your question. I think that there are inherent challenges to monetizing the broader charity space. Obviously, many players have tried to do it, but I think reaching meaningful scale and kind of a potential exit for a venture type investment in this space will be incredibly tough. I think that said, on the monetization side, the area that I'm probably most excited about within this space is kind of any type of monetization around tipping. I think that you are seeing more of these voluntary payments coming into play in numerous spaces, and consumers, increasingly showing a willingness to pay there. And so, I think coin toss, do I think some venture scale business will reach $1 billion exit in the space? Likely no. That said, it doesn't mean that it's not a meaningful category, or one that we should continue to be aware of as we think about where consumers are focusing their attention, both from a time and wallet perspective.
It's interesting, Meera, your post here has sort of, it talks about the unbundling of religion. There's a famous Barksdale quote of people, only make money by unbundling or bundling. Is there a world in which all of these get bundled up into, this one big, is there a world in which it's like, you mentioned earlier, you wake up in the morning, you go to SoulCycle, but that same company also feeds you, and the same company is also a co-working space, and that same company also is your where you do your mental health stuff, your confessions. Is there sort of a new age religion that's not a religion, or is there sort of I don't know, some enterprising entrepreneurs who are orthodox religious who come and try to bundle all of this stuff? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that, we've seen so much unbundling that few of us can keep track of all of our subscriptions, and are experiencing a sense of fatigue across the broader space. I think that, we are really excited about the rebundling of some of these categories. I think, you're seeing it on the brick and mortar side with more interdisciplinary focused clinics. I think digitally, there are companies like Modern Health that are bringing together anything from more traditional therapy to, lighter touch meditations. And so I do think that, there's certainly market appetite for rebundled solutions as it relates to building a platform that serves as one's sole identity. I personally think that's less likely. I think that, as we all work in these environments that advocate bringing our whole selves to work or what have you, I think that we are increasingly seeing that individuals, are identifying with, 3 to 5 to 7 plus specific corners of their identity. And I think asking them to choose one and exclusively following kind of the principles, beliefs, and practices of that single identity, it feels slightly out of the 1950s, and I don't necessarily know if that's a reality that we want to or necessarily should go back to.
Annie, what do you think?
Will you rephrase the question to me?
Sure. Is there going to be sort of a rebundling of these aspects in some ways? One way could be a company that not just provides your workout routine, but also provides your meals, also provides co-working, also rebundles sort of a bunch of these different categories in a secular way or in a religious way. But I think it is interesting. We do have new sort of big tech companies every 20 years, every 30 years, even with all of their data network effects, they get disrupted. Whereas traditional religions don't have data network effects. They're just stories, right? And they, last hundreds of years or longer. And new ones don't really emerge. You could imagine sort of like Pixar, I don't know, some great storytelling organization. I'm sort of going off the rails here. What's coming to mind for you?
We should start a religion, it sounds like.
I think that's the conclusion of this podcast.
So now this is a PSA for anybody who wants to join Meera, Annie, and Erik's new religion.
Yeah. We'll figure out who's CEO afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. From a Maslow hierarchy of needs perspective, we're always going to have religions. And because they're a form of belonging and identity, and in some ways, more importantly, going down the pyramid, they're a form of safety for people. One of my favorite books that I read recently is Sapiens. I think many folks have read that one. One of the key things I took away there is the idea of beliefs is one of the things that corely makes us humans. The idea that we can persuade one or another or use our imaginations to believe something that actually usually doesn't have much factual basis to it, or rather has been a story that's been passed down relative to something rather than something that we've seen firsthand. That I don't think is going to change. That's how we're built as people, and what those things end up being if they continue to be the core religions of this country and this world, or if new ones emerge. I think new ones certainly will emerge. The question is kind of how big will they become?
When something has a cult audience, quote unquote cult audience, like I'm following this product Rome Research. There's a thing called Rome Cult. It's like a productivity tool, but there's a hashtag called Rome Cult, and people like are really excited about it. But then their products, I'm not super familiar with Girl Boss, but my understanding is that it had a, popular audience, but didn't sort of sustain. I'm not sure. But like, how do you think about things that when they have sort of cultish audiences or really passionate audiences, whether that's defensible or whether that's lasting versus just sort of a flash in the pan?
I think a cult following is one of the most important early indicators for a consumer product. And the reasons is that it not only demonstrates product market fit, but it demonstrates virality and to grow a business that's actually more important than what a small group of folks might have to say about it. But if you can find a type of product and a group of people that are effusive about it, that is a really important early indicator in any consumer company.
Totally. Do you have a framework for determining whether it will last?
The short answer is I don't have a framework.
Right.
Maybe a different way of answering that question is in thinking about the question of will that early consumer excitement last over the course of many years, and also will it extend to other groups of people other than these kind of first early adopters? I would think about that in two ways. The first would be what would be my expected LTV of this product. So a business like food delivery, for example, quite timely. If you think about early DoorDash users, they were suburban parents that were feeding their family. And instead of piling 2.5 kids and the golden retriever in the back of their car and driving downtown to pick up food, they were paying somebody to bring it to them. That is a really long LTV customer because the need of, or at least high potential long LTV customer, because the need of feeding a family, over the course of days, weeks, months, years is pretty obvious. As opposed to maybe a counterexample would be, a single transaction product. Once you get it, you have it, and you're going to tap out a market eventually. I would think about those two types of companies quite differently.
How is this all different in a post-COVID era? Imagine, 6 months from now, a year from now, we're sort of back into our regular worlds. What's changed? Meera, you had a blog post, maybe we start with you, on the experience economy. And I'm curious, 6 months from now, a year from now, when we're in theory back, what behaviors are going to be different as a result of this, having had this COVID experience, I guess, in terms of IRL versus, digital?
Yeah, so I think I would kind of answer that in two ways. First, I think it's important to understand the shift that we could see in terms of the broader kind of social personal branding space. I think over the past few years, it's been increasingly popular to have the perfect Instagram post in the perfect location with, the very manicured outfit, aesthetics, what have you. I think our illusions of perfect are passing very quickly as COVID takes over. Moving forward, I don't know if we are going to see those kind of same goals across society. And so in a society that is perhaps more focused on, picking up the pieces, kind of taking care of their families, meeting their very basic needs, I think that we will return to kind of more of the fundamentals of what makes someone healthy and happy, those being anything from physical activity to social interaction, to poor diet, to broader healthcare. I think that, this period of isolation that so many of us are feeling is driving people to focus more inwardly and understand kind of what those needs are and how they can best meet those needs coming out of this. I think, we are being pushed to our limits in terms of incorporating the digital components if and when we can slot them in to alleviate some of these pressures during the shelter-in-place period. I think it will be very exciting to see kind of how many of these primarily IRL experiences are able to provide a little bit more flexibility for users as they kind of continue to incorporate some of these digital dynamics once we are all back in the wild again. But what exactly that looks like, I'm not sure, but certainly excited to see.
Any last reflections from you on what post-COVID life could look like in terms of changed consumer behavior, or any reflections of what we've spoken about thus far?
Yeah, I think fundamentally everyone will now ask the question, does this have to be in real life? Does that doctor's appointment have to be in real life? Does that meeting have to? Does that class? Does that, fun social activity? Everything that people have done in person will be up for question of, could this actually be done remotely? And is there a reason why I actually might prefer it to be remote? So, a few specific things I think are very interesting. One is telemedicine. I think this is going to move what has already happened in telemedicine forward even more dramatically. The second would be this idea of kind of blending work and family and life. When you're working from home, it all becomes kind of the same thing, running in between Zoom meetings, to feeding your kids lunch, to walking out the door and taking a walk in between meetings. Like, it's a much more mixed media way of living than it is compartmentalized. And then the third related to that is, for years there's been a lot of conversation about the consumerization of enterprise. And I think given that last thing I mentioned, we will see more kind of enterprisation of the consumer, meaning we want to bring the productivity of our work lives into our home lives. And I think that's going to be a big opportunity for companies.
Totally. I think that's a great place to wrap. My guests today have been Meera Clark and Annie Kadavy. Meera, Annie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. If entrepreneurs are working on anything interesting, you'd be lucky to have Meera and Annie on your cap table, or even get a meeting with them. Guys, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Erik. Thanks, Annie.
Thank you.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.